Amen. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you today. Remember that today is our special contribution for the mission trip that about 30 of our folks are going to be taking this July to Guatemala. And we've been trying to get word out every week, and even this week some special phone calls or text messages you may have received. Everything today that is over our budget goes toward helping us with that trip. And I hope you've come prepared to try to give generously for that great work, that great cause. That's going to be a really life-changing experience for many people in this church. And I think it'll have a way of just sort of infiltrating the whole body. And so we're excited about that. Several years ago, Jane Lee and I, along with a small group of folks, had the opportunity to travel to England and Scotland and France. And while we were there, we had our van stolen. We had rented a van once we got to France, and we were going to turn it in Paris. And we stopped right before, just within hours before we were due to turn the van in, went into a little shopping mall kind of area, came back out, and the van was just gone. It was bad enough that all of our luggage was stolen. Some of us even had our passports in the van and had to spend the rest of the day at the embassy getting passports reissued. But for me personally, the greatest loss was my camera and all the pictures we had taken. We came home with no pictures of that trip. And 25 years later, I still grieve that loss. Because I don't know that I'll ever get to go back again and reshoot those pictures and have those memories. You know, as bad as it hurts to have something stolen, and probably everybody in here has had something stolen from you at one time or another, right? As bad as that feels, maybe an even more disturbing question is, have I ever stolen anything? And perhaps an even more probing question is, am I stealing something right now? Am I a thief? Well, we get to the 8th commandment today, and the 8th commandment says, you shall not steal. Stealing violates at least 3 fundamental principles of biblical ethics. First, it violates the second greatest command. There's your first blanks to fill in. Violates the second greatest command. You know, Jesus said the greatest command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, and that is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. No one wants to have their possessions stolen. Maybe it's a treasured gift that you received from a loved one. Maybe it's something that you worked really hard for to purchase for yourself. Or maybe it's something that literally is irreplaceable, like my pictures. Those can't be replaced. But whatever it is, when somebody steals something from you, you feel violated. Not only violated physically, you feel violated personally. So if you would not want someone stealing from you, then why would you steal from another person? That violates the you shall love your neighbor as yourself command. Paul says pretty much the same thing in Romans 13, 9 and 10. Whatever other commandment there may be is summed up in this one rule, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Secondly, stealing violates the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. One of the interesting things is that the Bible assumes that it's okay to actually own things, to possess things. Let me give you an illustration of that. In Acts chapter 4, we read about how the church, Acts 2, 3, and 4, how the early church there in Jerusalem, many of the people there were in great need, physically and financially. And so the church shared what they had with one another, their possessions with one another. And so obviously, for them to be able to share means they had actual ownership of things to share. When we get to the 5th chapter of Acts, we see the story of Ananias and Sapphira, who sold a field and then gave part of the proceeds to help support their needy brothers and sisters. The problem was, as you remember, they let everybody believe that they had given all of the proceeds of the sale for the use among the poor, when in fact they held back part of the proceeds for themselves. So there was deception in all of that. They wanted to get credit for more than they actually had done. And you know, in that story, God actually smote them for doing that, for lying to the church. The problem was not ownership. The problem was dishonesty and lack of stewardship. As a matter of fact, Peter asked them before they were killed, he said, that property belonged to you to begin with, didn't it? And you had the ability and the right to do with it whatever you chose. And yet you chose to lie about this. So the problem wasn't ownership, it was stewardship. But the point I think here that we're trying to make is that if you would not want someone deceiving you in matters such as this, then why would you want to deceive and withhold from others what you'd committed to do? Here's the third principle that's violated, and that is God's providential care. When Jesus was preaching the Sermon on the Mount, He was talking to people who primarily were poor. Many of them had trouble on a day-to-day basis just putting food on the table and clothes on their backs. Jesus knew that they often were worried about these things. And Jesus said, I don't want you to worry about them. Look at the birds of the air. And look at the grass and the flowers of the field. God feeds the birds. God takes care of the fields. If God would do that for birds and fields, don't you know He will take care of you, who are much more valuable to Him than birds and the fields? And then Jesus said, seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these other things God will provide for you. And so there again, the principle is, when we steal from other people, we are basically saying to God, I don't trust you, God, to provide for me the things I need. Therefore, I'm going to go out and steal them. Otherwise, I won't have anything. God says, no, you seek me first. You seek my righteousness, and the things you need, I will provide. Well, how might we be guilty of stealing? I'm going to suggest 8 ways today that I think are pretty practical. By the time I get through with this list, you may have thought of some other ways that we steal, but consider these for today. Here's the first one, and it's the most obvious one. Let's just call it common thievery. Common thievery, shoplifting, or forgery, or identity theft, or burglary, are just a few of the kinds of things that I think fit the classification of just common thievery. There are several places in the Bible where we are told, do not steal. Not just in the Ten Commandments, but we're told in many places in Scripture, don't steal. I believe we all know that outright stealing is wrong. And so you may be thinking, well, I don't rob anybody. I've not committed forgery. I don't shoplift. I've never been engaged in identity theft or any of those other kinds of forms of common thievery. So I've got this commandment licked. I got this one taken care of. But as we have seen with every one of these commands, there's usually a whole lot more here than meets the eye on the surface. So let's look at some other ways that we can steal. The second way is that we can engage in unfair labor practices. Now that goes 2 ways. Employees can be guilty of unfair labor practices. Employers can be guilty of that. Let's look at employees first. Sadly, it's a common practice for some employees to steal on a regular basis from their employers. Tools walk off the site. Office supplies disappear. But there are other less obvious ways that we commit this sin sometimes. Sometimes people will show up for work consistently late. And unless they have to punch a clock where that time is actually recorded when they come in, they get paid for a full day's wage, and yet they come in consistently late. Or they spend too much time at the water cooler. Or they take a lunch break far in excess of what the employer wants them to take. When we do that, as employees, we are stealing from our employer. Or they secretly use the office computer for their own personal business use. Or use the company copy machine for their own personal use. Or lift a stamp or two or the postage meter for their own personal use. When you do that from your employer, you're stealing. If you are an employer, you can steal from your employees by refusing to pay them a fair wage. Now, I understand when we start talking about wages, the word fair is a debatable term, it's a relative term, and this is not the time and place to give definition to what fair is. But the point is, in every community, there is a genuinely or generally recognized standard of pay scale, and to pay below that is wrong. To cheat your employees out of benefits that you'd promised to give them, you're stealing from your employees. When Paul was writing to the Colossian church, he gave them some important instructions regarding both employers and employees. Paul in this passage used the words slave and master. Now, those words may be offensive to us. I don't want you to get hung up today on the word slave and master, because we have to realize that in the Roman world in which Paul lived, the mighty Roman Empire had conquered entire nations of people. And so slaves, people who were conquered, were often made slaves, and they were people of all kinds of ethnic backgrounds, all kinds of skin colors, all kinds of nations. So let's don't get hung up on the slave thing for this particular lesson. The point I want to make here is, I think let's just look at the word slave and master as employee and employer. Now listen to what Paul says, and we're going to insert the word employee and employer instead of slave and master. Colossians 3:22 down through the first verse of chapter 4. First, Paul addresses the employees, and he says, employees, obey your earthly employers in everything. And do it not only when their eyes on you to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. And then Paul moves on to talk to the employers. And he says, employers, provide your employees with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master who is in heaven. Here's the third way that we can steal. We can engage in dishonest or unfair business practices. There are many ways that this can be done. But for instance, if you have a business, when you overcharge your customers, you steal from them. One of the most egregious examples of this are the payday loan businesses. I hope you don't go to a payday loan establishment for money. Because if you do, you are being robbed blind. It makes me angry. And we've got several of them within a stone's throw of this building. They take advantage of people's lack of information or their hardship. Do you know that the interest rate, when you annualize the interest rate from those places, the interest rate is often in the triple numbers and can even reach over 1,000% interest? Folks, that may be legal. I think it ought to be declared illegal. Right now, our nation says it's legal, but it's not moral and it's not ethical. Now, that's just an example of how you can take advantage in an unfair way of your clients. When you misrepresent a product or a service, you steal from your clients and your customers. In Bible times, this was often done with false measures and false scales. You know, you use weights that aren't what you claim they are, and then you charge people as if you're telling the truth. Leviticus 19:35 and 36 says, "Don't cheat when measuring length, weight, or quantity. Use honest scales and weights and measures." Here's a fourth way people can cheat. and can steal. We can commit fraud. Now, that's closely related to what we've just talked about, but I do think there's an important distinction. Fraud occurs when you intentionally deceive someone in order to get them to give up something of value to them, usually their money, so that you can personally gain from their loss. When fraud takes place, there is always trickery involved in some way or another, and there's always dishonesty. When you or I take advantage of the weakness or the ignorance of others in a way that exploits them for our own personal gain, we defraud those people and we steal from them. In business dealings, sometimes people pride themselves in driving a hard bargain, we say. They say, well, it's just good business. Listen, it's not wrong to be an astute business person. But when others consistently come out on the short end of the stick, and when others are exploited, it's wrong. It may be business, but it's not good. There are several examples in the Bible of people who committed fraud. One of them is found in Genesis chapter 27. You remember the story of Jacob and Esau. Esau he was the oldest, born first, and he had the birthright. And so Jacob wanted his birthright. He tricked his brother, deceived his brother. Esau was not totally innocent in this because he was pretty foolish in doing what he did. But still, Esau deceived his brother and got him to trade his birthright for a bowl of soup. And in doing that, Jacob, in collusion with his mother, deceptively fooled their father. You remember he went in and dressed in animal skins as if to make it seem like the elderly father, blind at that, couldn't tell. Let's fool him and make him think that I'm actually Esau instead of Jacob and get him to give me his blessing, which is what his father did. And so what Jacob did was he committed fraud. He deceived his brother, he deceived his father in order to gain something for his own personal benefit to the harm of his brother who rightfully should have had the birthright. He stole. Leviticus 19 verse 13 says, "Do not defraud your neighbor or rob him." Now on this command, as in most of them, God just gets right in our face and challenges us to carefully examine ourselves. See, so far you may be thinking, well, you hadn't really hit me yet, because I'm not guilty of any of that stuff. I'm not a common thug. I don't rob convenience stores. I don't snatch purses. I don't break into houses. I'm not an employer who takes advantage unfairly of employees. I'm not a business person who initiates wrong business practices. And to my knowledge, I'm not guilty of outright fraud, so I'm still in pretty good shape. Well, God's going to start meddling. So let's keep going. Another way to steal is not paying your bills. Now, there are occasions for all of us when we fall on unexpected hard times. Maybe you lose a job, or you experience serious illness, and the medical bills begin to pile up faster than you can pay them off. Sometimes we do everything right in regards to our finances, and still misfortune, unexpected, hits us and creates all kinds of financial burdens and hardships, making it difficult, if not impossible, to pay all the bills. When that happens, that's understandable, but that's not really what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is when we spend irresponsibly. When we pull out our credit cards and we buy things that we cannot afford and pile up debts that we cannot pay, we're stealing. It's stealing, you say? How do you say that? Well, it's because we're keeping things that don't belong to us. They don't belong to us because we haven't paid for them. And what's worse, there are people who will buy things on credit knowing from day one they have no intentions of paying that debt. And there's no way other than to say theft to describe that. It's just outright theft if that's what a person does. David wrote in Psalm 37:21, "The wicked borrow and do not repay." Romans chapter 13, verse 8, Paul gives us some unmistakably clear instructions. Let me read it to you in several different translations. They all make sense, but it's interesting to see how the different translators put this. The King James Version says, "Owe no man anything." New International Version says, "Let no debt remain outstanding." The Message says, "Don't run up debts." The Living Bible simply says, "Pay all your debts." And so, if you're in financial trouble because you've not used good judgment in what you've spent, if you're in deep debt, my heart goes out to you for dealing with that. But I want to encourage you to find someone, a trusted counselor, who can help you not only figure out a way to pay back what you owe, but how to manage what you have so that you don't get in that kind of problem in the future. Here's a sixth way that we can steal. It's called tax evasion. Anybody still working on your April 15 deadline? I mean, we're all conscious of paying our taxes this time of year. Some of us have already gotten them turned in, some haven't. But that deadline is only 24 days away. Tax evasion is not the same thing as tax avoidance. Tax avoidance is not only legal, it's a good thing. Tax avoidance is where you legitimately take advantage of laws that allow you, for instance, to take deductions. Your charitable contributions that you make to this church or to other charitable organizations is just one example. The government says, we're going to allow you to deduct from your income tax the charitable deductions that you make. That's a legitimate tax avoidance thing that's built into our laws. Tax evasion is completely different from that. Tax evasion is when you intentionally try to find ways to illegally hide your income so that you don't pay taxes on what you legitimately owe the government. And that even includes not declaring income that you've earned. Perhaps you're paid in cash and you just never tell the government that you earned that money. That's stealing. Romans chapter 13, the beginning verses there talk about how God has put into place the governments that establish laws that regulate and guide what we do. And so in the very first verse, Paul says everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. But specifically in verse 7, Paul writes that we are to pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed. And so since that's the law of our land, when we intentionally try to find ways to stiff the government, even though we may disagree with the way the government spends our money, when we intentionally try to find ways to stiff the government, then we're disobeying God and we're stealing. Here's another way that we can steal. We can steal other people's ideas. When you cheat on an exam, you're stealing somebody else's work and turning it in as your own. When you make illegal photocopies of material that clearly say they are copyrighted materials, you're stealing. When you illegally duplicate and download copyrighted music that you've not paid for, you're stealing from the people who wrote and recorded and produced that music. Even preachers are guilty of this one. Because preachers can take somebody else's sermon and preach it as their own without giving any credit. Now, 2 or 3 times since I've been here, I've gotten up and I've said, I read such and such somebody's sermon. It was so good, I'm just going to preach his sermon to you. That's not plagiarism, because I've given credit. Or if I quote somebody, I say, so-and-so said this. That's legitimate. That's like putting a footnote in paper that you're writing or giving credit to the individual. But when you teach that or preach that as if it's your own and you don't give anybody credit, it's called plagiarism. Not only is it illegal, it's stealing. So even we preachers can do that. The same passage in Romans chapter 13 that we cited just a moment ago tells us that we need to obey the laws of our land. Our country, every country that I know of, but certainly in America, we have laws that protect people's creative work. Whether it's writing a book, whether it's writing a song, it's called intellectual property. Do you know there are lawyers who specialize in nothing but intellectual property? They're the ones who if you're a musician, for instance, and you earn your living by writing music or by recording music, and you depend on people buying that music for your own livelihood, and yet other people download it off the internet and never pay for it, or they get somebody else's CD and they make their own copy of it without paying for it, you are taking money right out of that person's pocket. That's why we have copyright laws. They're intended to protect people's property. That's their intellectual property, and if we want to use it, we need to pay for it. When we don't pay for it, we're stealing. I don't know if you've ever noticed when we sing songs up here, the last slide of every song has what, CCLI, is that what it is? What's that stand for, John? Christian Copyright License. John gives credit, or Gary gives credit when we do the slides for every song, because did you know that when we sing these songs, we buy a license every year. Every church is required to do this. And the people who, some of those songs are copyrighted, and so they get credit for that. They get maybe a penny or two or whatever. But we have to do that. If we didn't do that, we as a church would be breaking the law. Now that one's really meddling, isn't it? And we laugh because probably most of us have done that. And then here's the last way. It's not really the last one. It's the last one I'm going to mention today because you've probably already thought of some others. We can steal by robbing God. The way we rob God is by giving Him meager gifts. And when we do that, we reveal two things about ourselves. Number one, we reveal that we really don't care about the hurting and the lost people the way God does, because part of our giving does go to help and support those who are in need. But the second thing it reveals about us, it shows that we have a faith problem. It shows that we really don't trust God to keep the promises that He has made to us. That's why we hoard things, and that's why we give God sometimes such meager gifts, because we think if we give Him generously like He's asked us to, there'll be less for us and we won't have what we need and want. Listen to what Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, says. This is one of those hard-hitting verses. Will a man rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how do we rob you? In tithes and offerings. You are under a curse, the whole nation of you, because you are robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you will not have room enough for it. Now, the Old Testament commanded God's people to tithe, to give a 10% of all their income. The New Testament doesn't have a passage like that. There's no passage that prescribes what percent we should give. The New Testament simply says that we should give willfully, cheerfully, that we should give as we have been prospered. But I don't know of any New Testament passage that teaches us to do less than what God required the Israelites to do. See, when we give God the leftovers, God says, you're robbing me. And in reality, when you read that passage that we just read, we look at it carefully from Malachi, it's still on the screen. Not only do we rob God, but we actually rob ourselves. Because God said, if you will trust me to open generously from what you have been given, if you will give to me like I have told you to give to me, I will open the floodgates of blessings, and you'll have more blessings than you can imagine. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that God's going to give you back $2 for every dollar you give Him. It may mean that He gives you good health. It may mean that He blesses you in other ways. Just trust God to figure out what's the best thing for you. But He says, when you give to me like I've told you to in faith, I will pour out more blessings on you than you can imagine. And so when we don't do that, we're not only stiffing God, we're stiffing ourselves. We're cutting our nose off to spite our face. We just need to trust Him. Now, let's not overlook one more important biblical teaching about this before we make some real practical suggestions. Number one, on this not overlooking, let's not overlook the biblical requirement to make restitution when we have stolen something. Many passages in the Bible about this. Let me read this one from Numbers 5. Any man or woman who wrongs another in any way must confess the sin they have committed. They must make full restitution for the wrong they have done, add a fifth of the value to it, and give it all to the person they have wronged. If we had more time, we'd talk about the story of Zacchaeus in the New Testament. Remember Zacchaeus? Tax collector. When he finally came to believe in Jesus, he said, whoever I've wronged, I'll not only pay them back, I'll pay them back how many times what I've stolen from them? 4. So this idea of restitution is a very biblical command and idea. So look at some very practical applications quickly. Number one, respect other people's property. Thievery and dishonesty will endanger your soul. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul says that thieves and swindlers will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. Number 2, be a good steward of what God has given you. While we do have the right to own and possess things, God also warns us to not love our possessions more than we love Him. We need to remember that everything we have belongs to God, and God says, you're the manager of those things, and I expect you to manage them well. Be a good steward of what God has given you. And then third, make an honest living so you can share with those in need. Ephesians chapter 4 verse 28 says, anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. And here's the beautiful blessing that comes with that kind of compassionate generosity. It comes with a promise. The wise man wrote this in Proverbs 11:25. A generous man will prosper. He who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. You shall not steal, the Lord says. And I think we can all see, I have been just as challenged as you have, that goes a whole lot deeper than we normally think that it does. It really causes us to probe deeply into our own behaviors and motives and practices to make sure that we are not stealing from others. This morning, do you have a need to come to be baptized into Christ, to confess your faith? It'd be wonderful to see that today, to help you and assist you with that. There may be other things that you'd like us to pray with you about. If we can help in any way, come right now. Let's stand and sing together.